Boop, boop, boop. Hello. Oh, okay. I can't hear myself. Good. And I definitely have a shirt on. Don't worry about it. I'm so... The camera's in my face. Stream will stop immediately and you will no longer be live. Oh. I'm already live. I know how live works. I do this all of the time. Haven't touched live in like over a month. I'm a little rusty. Hi, anyone who's here or will be here or will want to be here or will watch this back as a VOD one day? Hi, I'm Rachel. This is my book club. Welcome to the book club. Vampires are my special interest book club. No, I have not found a less awkward way of saying that. Vampires are my special interest book club. One day I'm going to have a logo, and I'm so excited to have it pop on screen when I do that. Yeah, so typically here we read vampire books, primarily vampire short story anthologies, but when we're between books, we go a little crazy. We go a little wild. We read like academic journals about Dracula. Today, lucky for anybody catching the stream, we are just going to read a normal anthology. I have not been live in a minute. I have no excuses for my actions. It was really just kind of burnout, I say, as though I didn't just say I wasn't going to give you an excuse. I don't honestly know. Something about going live makes me nervous, and I'm not very... I don't feel particularly good at it yet, despite the practice. So that, on top of actual burnout, did push me away for a while. Sorry for disappearing for like a month. But I'm here. I got a new tripod, which is completely distracting me. And I got a little microphone stand thingy. So it's like close to me, and I don't have to hunch over it and worry about the audio. It's right here. Also, I am wearing a shirt. Please don't tell the TikTok police about that. Okay. I'm out of things to ramble about. I feel like last time I read this anthology, which is Vampires edited by Jane Yolen and Martin H. Greenberg. And it came out in the early 90s, 1991. I didn't prepare properly. I've been ignoring this book since the last time I streamed. So there's going to be words in here I'm not going to know how to pronounce, and I am definitely going to butcher. And I believe I said that last time, and I must have skipped a story in here. We may as well just go back and read it anyway. May as well butcher it, whatever. Okay, I know we read this. We read that one. Did we read Oval? Bees drone among the wild roses growing on the crumbling stone wall. Nested in high grass under a gnarled oak, Lily opened the book she'd received last week on her 13th birthday and breathed deeply of warm, sweet air. Yes, we read that one, and it has to do with a child vampire, and it's really good, and the VOD is still up if you want to hear it. Okay, this one I must have skipped because it's got words. It's got words in it. Let's go. A Cold Steak by Phyllis Ann Carr. I apologize for what I'm about to do to whatever language I'm about to say. Eat your soup before it curdles, said Aunt Celia. It was an old family joke. But the young guest on the other side of the holly wreath centerpiece from Clement had obviously never heard it before. Yuck, he choked. A disgusting sound before it curdles? Oh, crash it, Gary. Trivy, said with a toss of her short black hair. Mom was just, wait, a toss of her short black curls. We're gonna get this down. We're back. It's gonna be fine. Mom was just kipping Clemmy a little. Chownina doesn't curl. She pronounced it Chownina, more like a Mexican dog than a Central European delicacy. Please, cousin, Tivoli, Clement told her, partly to change the subject. Now that I'm a university man, I'd rather you use my full name. What the fever is this stuff? Gary insisted. Uncle Jan winked one of his slightly almond-shaped eyes at the guest. Chocolate soup. Another old joke. Gary glared at him. Don't baby me, M. O'Reilly. I'm taking the test next month. This stuff's got blood in it, doesn't it? Just duck's blood, Trivy snapped. Honestly, if you aren't a baby, don't act like one. Look at it, all red and... It isn't red, it's brown. Oh yeah, with my current... I completely forgot my current setup is for recording stuff, so I am front and center. I tend to like it. Never mind. You know what? I think I just changed the size. Nope. You know what? Just deal with it. I'm front and center, people. What's up? Let's go. How do I wish I'd made this smaller, though, because... Oh, hey, look at that. There I am. Unlock it so I can move it, and then I can make myself nice and small. Now we're watching vampire stories together, but with a pretty background, so you're not just staring at me, though hopefully you're probably not staring at me because this is a background noise. Regardless, this is better. For my mental health, this is better. Okay. Yuck! Look at it, all red and... It isn't red, it's brown. And how come you don't yuck at hamburger? That's got cow's blood in it, doesn't it? Trivia, said Aunt Cecilia, reverting to Trivoli's childhood nickname, short for the antique game of Trivial Pursuit. That will be enough. Remember, it's Christmas. Older people than Gary have stopped liking sarnina when they heard the recipe. Here, Gary, let me get you something else. Like the good hostess she was, Aunt Celie took Gary's bowl and retreated into the kitchen. Looking away from Gary, Clement fished a prune out of his own soup and took it whole into his mouth. Properly utilized, his fangs helped rather than hindered chewing the flesh of the fruit from around the pit. Aunt Celie always insisted that real sarnia demanded prunes with the pits still in them. Unpitted prunes were difficult to buy in this fourth decade of the 21st century, so Aunt Celie served sarnia only on Christmas and Easter. Yeah, I see why your cousin eats blood soup, said Gary, but how can he eat that, whatever he's chewing? The same way you can, said Trivy, and it's probably a prune. See? Her gold-polished fingernails gleaming, she brought her spoon up with a prune from her own bowl. Gary looked the other way and repeated, yuck! Guess he doesn't like prunes either, Uncle Jan remarked mildly. Clement swallowed the pulp, removed the pit from his mouth, and said, I can eat and drink the same things everybody else does, M. Gary, when good manners call for it. In fact, he got very little nourishment from blood when it was thoroughly cooked. He simply liked the flavor of chocolate soup. If you're going to me, the boy grumbled, then please use my family name. In case you forgot, it's Wilson, like one of the old presidents. They tell me yours is Battery, like the Transylvanian countess. Batory? Batory would sound less stupid. If you're going... Oh, wait, no, I read that. Like the great king of Poland, Trivy said, as if King Stefan hadn't been an earlier branch of the same family tree. Oomph, Gary Wilson replied. Okay, Trivia, O'Reilly. If we're onto kings and queens, why was Anne Boleyn's death better than Joan of Arc's? Trivy said, Joan of Arc wasn't a queen. Anne Boleyn was, and she had 6 fingers on one of her hands. Uncle Jan put in, "They're really teaching you kids the history in middle school these days." "We'd rather call it junior college," Gary said proudly. He had to be 12 if he was taking the test next month. He looked a little small for his age, or maybe that was because Trivy, at 13, was a little large for hers, thanks to her big-boned mother. "Joan of Arc was burned at the stake," said Trivy, "and Anne Boleyn had her head chopped off. And M. Quizwiz here probably learned it from screen cartoons. I didn't ask how they died. I assume you knew that much. I asked why Anne Boleyn's death was better than Joan of Arc's. Give up? Because a cold chop beats a hot steak." Gary looked straight at Clement when he said it. "I think you got that turned around, M. Wilson," Clement replied. "Don't you mean a hot steak beats a cold chop?" The pun on steak and steak was built into the joke, but the university man hoped and doubted. He had only imagined the subtler wordplay on a large steak and a small one, on chop and strike, and possibly on cold and cold-blooded. "Yeah," said Gary Wilson, still staring at Clement. "Yeah, what did I say?" Happily, just then, Aunt Celie returned with a steaming bowl of the chicken noodle soup she kept on hand to microwave her company who decided they didn't want sardina. The rest of the meal proceeded more in keeping with the holiday spirit, as Trivy showed herself ready to join the grown-ups in heading off Gary's bad manners. But tension continued beneath the surface as, at every glance across the table, Clement found young Wilson staring at him. A stiff-looking boy, clean as if scrubbed with plastimish, and neat enough. No dirt beneath the fingernails, yellow hair mown too short to get out of order. In fact, his hair looked almost like a fuzzy halo on some little bald saint. His tunic was good quality, but ripping a little near the collar. His eyes were definitely his worst feature, ice blue, slightly bloodshot, and with dark, puffy bags beneath them. How had Trivy come to befriend this young floater well enough to invite him for Christmas Day and overnight? Clement wondered, unless that surly temper was aimed entirely at Clement himself. Come on now, a mere child? Even the elementary psychology textbooks were beginning to admit that children, although legally classified as fantasy perceivers under the reformed Constitution, were actually the clearest reality perceivers of all. And reality perceivers could rarely, if ever, see vampires. Vampires did not fit into the legal definition of standard reality. Trivy herself had never been able to see her own cousin's true nature. Neither before nor after passing her first perception test last year with a score of 97%. All the same, Gary Wilson was old enough to have developed strong fantasy perception, and he had called the Sharnina red when it was, in fact, into all standard reality perception, the color of good milk chocolate. Clement helped Aunt Celia... No, good milk chocolate. Did I say mint? Ew. Why did I say ew to mint chocolate? I like mint chocolate. I have no idea. Clement helped Aunt Celie load the dish cleaner while Uncle Jan and the kids booted up the living room. When the dish loaders joined in, the holographic fire was casting out its electric warmth. The punch bowl was getting ready to steam on its cordless heater, and Trivy and Gary were seated at opposite sides of an upright screen game, one of this year's presents. Settling into his favorite armchair by the fireplace, Clement put up his feet, eyed the thermal jug that waited on the coffee table, and gave a contented sigh. Uncle Jan was playing solitaire with a manual deck. Aunt Celie had already started strumming carols on her acoustic guitar. The old-fashioned, genuine fringed plastic tree was glowing with battery candles and angel clouds. Trivy was maneuvering Inspector Marchpane's keystoners into a winning position. Gary Wilson was out of sight on the other side of the game screen, manipulating Clouseau's gendarmes. The thermal jug held a pint of the rich fluid that was Clement's true nourishment, and, for the moment, all was Christmas. It stayed so until until the traditional toast to the new millennium, now seeing its 40th Yuletide. Then, a moment after they lowered their cups, Uncle Jan made the obligatory comment somebody, no doubt, was making sometime this evening in every gathering throughout the continent. What was left of it? Maybe throughout the world. Well, it was just 11 years ago today. It being the Christmas earthquake of 2029, which had dumped the lower part of California into the Pacific Ocean. Something to look forward to. The summer before that disaster, Clement had been promised a trip to the original Disneyland for his 10th birthday. By the time that birthday arrived, the fabulous lost playland had lain beneath the waves for 2.5 years, never seen except for divers and mere people. Gary Wilson's voice cut into Clement's thoughts. Yeah, and it was the fantasy perceivers who brought on the quake, wasn't it? Clement's eyes and mouth both snapped open. Fantasy perceivers, M. Wilson, are not and never were any more immoral than reality perceivers. Trivy, Aunt Celie, and Uncle Jan were all scolding young Wilson at the same time, so there was no telling whose words he understood, if any, but he looked completely unabashed. Staring straight back at Clement, he almost shouted, "Yeah, everybody knows it. Fanciers and bloodsuckers and people like him." "Take it back," shouted Trivy. "No, it's true. Everybody knows. I was 7 years old when California sank." Clement found his voice trembling. "The accident that made me what I am didn't happen until I was 11. Look at him, sitting there drinking blood." "Gary Wilson," Aunt Celie raised her voice above everybody else's. "Shut up. I'm your guest. You can't tell me to shut up. Look at him. You can't even see him in the mirror." "You can't see him in the mirror, maybe," said Trivy. "Look at his bloody fangs." Clement turned and strode out, not trusting himself to speak. Snatching his cape from its peg in the hallway, he slammed the door behind him. The outside temperature was just cold enough to keep the snow from melting. He let his cape flap open as he stalked the old, straight sidewalks, wishing it was true that his kind could change into bats and fly through the night at will. Maybe some vampires could. Clement Batory Schnarns can't say that one, had to figure a lot of things out for himself, testing and proving the old legends scrap by scrap as they applied to him. It took him 2 kilometers of sidewalk, mainly shoveled or heated or sanded, but with here and there an isolated slick patch gleaming in the light from Christmas-decorated windows, before his temper cooled enough for him to begin examining his own behavior. It was a very secret self-examination he made. Wilson had obviously been the one to blame, fundamentalist young firebrand, and never would Clement have admitted to anybody that his own reaction might have been less than reasonable. In fact, if he hadn't left when he had, he might have gone for Gary Wilson's neck, a thing he had never yet done in his life, a thing he had sworn never to do to any unwilling or immature party. Maybe he should have his fangs ground down if he could ever find a dentist capable of perceiving them. It was not as if he really used them, and he seemed to be accidentally biting his own lip oftener than other people did. Some human blood he needed every day, but 3 drops added to a pint from any red-blooded animal were enough to make a perfectly nutritious meal. At a pinch, he could even recycle 3 drops of his own blood for the purpose, though too many nights of that diet and he began to feel the effects of malnutrition. But he might want his fangs someday, in plane wreck, shipwreck, or some other survival situation, or for some willing girlfriend whom he would never, God forbid, drain to the point of anemia. When he finally felt calm enough to apologize like a grown man, if his aunt and uncle absolutely insisted on it, he started back. Cutting across several lawns, an alley, and a new neighborhood park, he approached the house from behind. Pause to drink. Water. Trivy's annual igloo sat snug in the backyard, a dark blob faintly outlined by the light that filtered through the mock-stained glass nativity decal in the kitchen window. In his pre-university years, Clement had sometimes helped Uncle Jan and Trivy build the igloo, when he happened to be visiting at the time of a suitable snowfall. Many were the hours he had spent with his little cousin in the dome-like enclosure, telling stories, singing songs, playing checkers, sipping hot drinks from their thermoses. One year they had even tried making shadow animals. One year that had depths. Don't tell me I fucking disconnected and then reconnected. Jesus, don't scare me like that. Oy. Okay. It must be a not too powerful flashlight. He approached the dome's low crawlway with soft steps and froze, hearing the voices inside. Trivy and M. Gary Wilson. The vampire edged closer to listen. It was plain hot eggnog, Trivy was saying. Just exactly the same stuff the rest of us were drinking. It was blood. You're full of glitches. Mom just puts his in a different jug so he'll perceive it as. Damn it, you're all fanciers. It was blood. I could see it right through his cup. Hoo boy, he had a milk glass cup, just like the rest of us. Who's the fantasy perceiver now? I am not. You take that back, Trivia Tanaka O'Reilly. Fancier, fancier, fancier. Am not, am not, am not. Us Wilsons see it like it is. Fancier, fancier, fan. Us Wilsons have always seen it like it is. Grandpa Wilson, he saw the quake coming. Him and about 1 million scientists, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. And if these damn fanciers don't repent and change their lives, make up your glitchy mind. Is Clemmy a fancier or just a real vampire? He's a fancier vampire, and that makes him twice as evil and wicked and satanic. Heart thundering, fists clenched until the fingernails bit into his palms through the gloves. Clement turned and left, no longer worrying whether his footsteps made any noise or not in the lightly crusted snow. Yes, he needed his fangs, to show people what he was, so that they would know what to feed him, to keep him safe for human company. Except that reality perceivers couldn't see his fangs. Would they feel the bite? Oh yes, they'd feel the bite, if only as they felt an animal bite. It took a percentage of fantasy perception to see his fangs, to see that he was drinking blood when other people were drinking eggnog, to see his lack of a reflection. Most people's minds simply supplied Clement's mirror image and never understood that their eyes weren't registering it. But virtually everyone had some mix of fantasy perception. Scores of 100% on the standard reality perception test were so rare as to be laughable. 85% was enough to allow anyone to register as a reality perceiver. Trivy boasted 96% reality perception, and she saw his reflection, saw the blood in his jug as eggnog. Had she ever really glimpsed his fangs? Therefore, it took the right kind of fantasy perception to see Clement Sarni's true nature. I hope. No, it took the right kinds of reality perception. 101% reality perception, a secret, hidden percentage point beyond the grasp of standard reality. But virtually the entire population had always lived, in some percentage of fantasy perception. For centuries, it had been shrugged off as just the thing that made different people see things differently, and taste things, and smell things. Different strokes for different folks, different people, different preferences, marching to the beat of a different drummer. So to blame the Christmas quake on fantasy perception, on the fanciers, as if they and they alone were the immoral dirt of society, was monstrous. Even though he could, legally, have registered as a realizer, Clement shook with rage on behalf of all the hundreds of thousands of maligned fanciers made into scapegoats by the self-righteous of the continent, prigs like Gary Wilson and his grandfather. Yes, the 2020s had been a wild and lawless decade, because, as Professor Stivison explained it very clearly in her course, Introduction to the Socio-Economic History of the 21st Century, the premature attempt by the new reformed federal government to do away with all pocket coins and currency had pushed the button on the explosive combination of high unemployment, rising inflation, and the visibly widening gap between haves and have-nots. Damn. Do you have a time machine? Fuck. No, it's just what happens over time. The reformed constitutional recognition of fantasy perceivers' rights had nothing to do with it. The whole continent, fanciers and realizers alike, had gone crazy. Clement could remember some of the general craziness, even if Gary Wilson and, obviously, his grandfather could not. And the lower part of California would have sunk, even if the whole country had been sober and moral enough to please the Reverend Graham Flywell. It might have struck the religious lunatic fringe as Yahweh's judgment on the sins of the nation, but scientists had been warning people ever since the 20th century that it was going to happen sooner or later. According to Professor Stuyvesant, it wasn't even the quake that brought back normalcy as much as it was repeal of the Universal Credit Line Amendment and the increase of well-paid service jobs. Oh yes, if Clement Bathory Sarny had ever sank his fangs into Gary Wilson, he'd feel it. This time it was 2 hours after midnight when Clement came back, deep with perspiration, even though the outside temperature had fallen to 3 degrees below 0 Celsius. Aunt Celie was waiting up for him in the kitchen, sipping coffee and playing Marchpane vs. Clouseau against herself on Trivy's old tabletop game screen. Finish your blood, she told him warily, pouring it from the serving jug he had left almost full. Raw duck's blood is hard enough to get these days for any reason. We couldn't reheat it again, but Trivy's contributed 3 more drops from her own thumb before she went to bed. He was blessed in having an aunt he could always trust to set real blood before him, not try to give him something else, tell him it was blood, and look surprised when he, a supposed fantasy perceiver, recognized the difference. Thanks, Aunt Celie. He hung his cape by the door, removed his wet shoes, sat down across the table from her, and picked up his cup. I'm sorry if I spoiled Christmas for all of you. Well, I'm glad it didn't happen earlier in the day. Switching off the game screen, she pushed it to one side and took her cup in both hands. There's something about Gary that maybe we should have told you earlier. He's from what my grandparents would have called a badly broken home. Not just lack of any kind of formal marriage ceremony, something that seems to have had real hate in it. Apparently his mother and father were a joint procreational permit and were living together off and on all through the 30s. I gather the relationship slid further downhill every time they got together, batting Gary back and forth between them, giving him the brunt of it when they were living together and shuttling him off to one set of grandparents or the other when they were separated. Finally, last summer, Gary's father accused his mother of having cheated on the permit before Gary was born, back a year or so before the quake. He even threatened, in Gary's hearing, to start proceedings, have the boy declared illegitimate. It must have been very messy. Gary's mother packed up and left, giving no forwarding address. His father is off somewhere, maybe looking for her and maybe not. Gary's father's parents have refused to have anything more to do with their grandson, leaving the maternal grandparents to take care of him. Clement said, I could guess from some of the things he said what kinds of people they are. Try not to judge people too quickly, Clement. It isn't the best way to get them to accept you, after all. I've met the Wilsons, and she's a very good woman. Unfortunately, she had to be rushed to the hospital day before yesterday. Some kind of sudden hemorrhage. Gary's grandfather is spending most of his time at the hospital to be near her, but they felt it'd be better for the boy to have Christmas at home with somebody. That's why Trivy is trying so hard to make him feel like one of the family. A hemorrhage, Clement repeated. That may mean blood transfusions. Couldn't you have found a better home for him to spend Christmas in than one with a vampire in the family? You knew I'd be coming this afternoon. Pause to drink. Water. Why do I keep doing that? What we couldn't know was that Gary would turn out to be able to see you as a vampire. He's so intent on being a reality perceiver, so determined not to disappoint the part of his own family that still accepts him. I gather the old man is bitterly disappointed in his daughter, Gary's mother. That whole situation seems to have aggravated the way he blames fancy class immorality for... I know, I heard that message very clearly. I think they may even have had some idea what you'd be a kind of litmus test for Gary's reality perception. If so, he seems to have flunked it, Clement remarked rather bitterly. Chivy's been trying to coach him for the test. Not that anyone can really coach anyone else, but they're still at an age where they think anything's possible. That's why she had him in the igloo tonight, Clement. Lord, you don't think that bothers me, do you? You don't think I stamped away that second time out of some kind of sibling jealousy? The igloo is Trivy's. She can share it at any time with any chum or surrogate brother she wants. It was the things he said about me. Evil, satanic. Well, everyone and everything is evil and satanic to somebody else, somewhere in the world, Aunt Celie replied. That's the way it's always been and probably always will be. Trivy stuck up for you, I hope? Oh, yes, in her own inimitable way. Aunt Celie, what on earth is so disgraceful at being a registered fantasy perceiver? In some of the best circles, it's considered prestigious. Why, you're proud of the fact that you could have registered as a realizer, aren't you? Of your 90-plus reality perception? Yes, but I chose to register as a fantasy perceiver nevertheless. She asked delicately, as if she were blowing the insides out of a raw egg to have the shell for Easter craft. I thought you did that to make it easier for people to accept you. Yes, and it doesn't seem to have worked with people like Gary and Grandfather Wilson, does it? I'd hoped, said Aunt Celie, that you'd be able to understand his feelings, how desperately he wants his reality perception score. About to make another sharp retort, Clement looked again at his favorite aunt, saw the wariness in her plump face, the laugh lines looking sorrowful at the corners of her eyes and mouth, the gray hairs striping through the chestnut brown. Well, he said, for your sake, Aunt Celie, and the family's, in the spirit of the season, I will try. He got up, kissed her lightly on the forehead, and left the kitchen, taking the rest of the blood with him. They had put Gary up on the living room couch as Clement passed on the way to his own room, the same guest bedroom he always used. He heard the boy stir. He froze. But Gary Wilson had only turned in his sleep. In the cool glow of the tree lights, Clement gazed a moment at the youth, looking innocent as any other slumbering person. Was that why Clement so relished his role as a night person? Because so much of the hemisphere's population was sleeping and innocent by night? He began to turn away, stopped, and turned back. What was that, peeping out from beneath young Wilson's pillow, the end of a sharpened stake? No, surely not. Not here, beneath the roof of his hosts, the vampire's own family. Surely the tip of a thin flashlight, or perhaps a crucifix for self-defense, or, Clement smiled, remembering the season, a hidden candy cane? He started bending closer in an effort to make sure, but Wilson stirred again, and, thinking how such a person would react on awakening to find a vampire looming overhead, Clement retreated. In his own room, he sat in bed finishing his blood and reading textbooks until 4:30 hours when, yawning after all the hard walking he had done earlier, he tabbed off the reading light on the clock radio and soon fell asleep. Toward morning, he found himself in a long dream in which Trivy's igloo was a large, melting gingerbread palace. As he wandered from chamber to chamber, a spire or stalactite broke from the ceiling and fell, smacking him in the chest. There was a crunching sound, a dull pressure to his sternum, and a noise, grunt or cry or soft exclamation from somewhere above, a sobbing somewhere in the distance. He opened his eyes. He was lying on his back, looking up into Gary Wilson's face. In one hand, Wilson held Aunt Celie's meat-tenderizing mallet, and the other what was left of a breadstick. The upper end of the breadstick lay in crumbles over his hand in Clement's pajama shirt. The end of the lower half rested on Clement's sternum, harmlessly, but The sobbing was actually Trivy giggling as she peeked through the partly open door. "The joke's on you, Gary Wilson," she chirped out, coming into the room. "It's a breadstick." "It's a wooden stake. Why did it?" "Because it's a breadstick." She jumped to the bedside, picked up one of the larger crumbs, and put it into her mouth and crunched. "I pulled the switch on you last night, and you never even knew the difference. Fancier fan. I hate you, you idiot. I hate you." Dropping the mallet and what remained of the breadstick, Wilson fled from the room. "If there's any hating to be done here," Clement began, sitting up and rubbing his chest where the mallet had landed. "God, that brat tried to kill me." "Someday it might become a family joke. Remember the Christmas Strivoli's friend tried to stake Clement with a breadstick?" For now, after the initial round of laughter, Aunt Celie at least took it seriously. He'll get a good talking to," she promised Clement. "We'll make sure he understands. If it hadn't If it hadn't been for Trivy, he might have succeeded. He was doing what he thought was right. You knew you might be running risks when you made up your mind to live openly as a Dracula, Clement." "But I've got him now. Attempted murder. Does he still want to be a realizer? Under the circumstances, a fantasy perceiver might conceivably get off with much later sentence if it ever came to trial." "Yes, he does," said Aunt Celie. "You see what he risked in order to do what he thought was right. Clement, you say he called you evil and satanic. Prove to him you aren't. Don't report this." "I can't promise that. Not yet. He tried to murder me, after all. I'll have to think about it, Aunt Celie. For now, that's all I can promise you." The boy tried to murder you, and why would you tell him not to report him for that? Jesus. He thought about it for a month and decided to make his final decision after they saw how Gary Wilson tested out. The last Tuesday of January was a bright, clear day. Clement made a phone call to Aunt Celie and learned that Grandmother Wilson was home from the hospital but still weak, and Grandfather Wilson was staying with her while Uncle Jan and Trivy took Gary to the testing station. His test was scheduled for 1400 hours. Clement hopped a fast needle train and arrived about 14:30. He spent almost an hour on a park bench across the street from the testing station. Young Wilson emerged at 15:20. Trivy on one side of him and Uncle Jan on the other. From the lively way they were talking, Clement guessed that Gary Wilson had made it into the reality-perceiving majority. He stood up and waved. Gary stopped dead until Trivy nudged him forward. Very reluctantly, seeing that Trivy was holding Uncle Jan back at the same time, the boy finally crossed the street alone. He stopped at a safe distance from the vampire. "Congratulations," Clement began. "I saw by your faces that you passed. 91%. How can you stand out here in the sunlight?" "Sunlight doesn't bother me except at noon on the solstices and equinoxes. I'm nocturnal in the sense that most people are diurnal. My natural rhythms put me at my sharpest and strongest during the night hours. But that doesn't mean I can't get around as well by day as other people do at night." "Oh," said Gary. "Garlic doesn't bother me either, not as a seasoning. In fact, I enjoy it. The blossoms give me a touch of hay fever. You can also forget about crosses if that's what you're looking for in your pockets. The Anka, the ancient Egyptian loop-headed cross, makes me a little queasy. Otherwise, no problem. In fact, I'm a churchgoer." "Oh," Gary repeated, taking his hands out of his pockets. "You'd be surprised how much is just old gossip's tales, at least as it applies or doesn't apply to us in general. It may vary from individual to individual." "Oh. Look, thank you for not saying anything about, I could still say something, In fact, if I'd been in the testing room with you, chances are you wouldn't have passed." "Yeah, I know. Look, thanks again. I'm real sorry." Clement swept one edge of his cape up across his chest. "Thank Trivy. Sorry wouldn't mean much to any of us if I'd been killed. As far as standard reality is concerned, we vampires are just fancy-class people. Murdering one of us would land you in as much trouble as murdering anyone else." I know. Gary's tone hinted at what the lectures he must already have endured. "Look, what do you want? $1 million $try and blackmail?" At least he hadn't mentioned blood. Relenting a little, Clement shook his head. Just a promise. Never to attack anyone just because he or she is a vampire. And if you ever do meet one of us who happens to be wicked, there are probably still some wicked vampires, just as there are wicked human beings. Don't try to handle the problem yourself. Report it to the authorities. What a good that'd do. They don't see vampires. They're reality perceivers. M. Wilson, wickedness means committing crimes any realizer can see, and a few of the authorities might even be secret 101% reality perceivers, like you and me. I'm just a 91%. You perceive what I really am in my software that makes you 101% realizer, no matter what the standard test says. Dropping his cape, Clement took his glove and extended his hand. Here, promise and shake on it. That's it? That's really all you want? That's it. That's really all I want. Wilson grinned, stepped forward, and shook hands. Right. 101%. That story was incredibly boring. Give me one moment while I do something. I have to do insulin things because I'm stupid. Stare at this pretty light. Okay. Why do I eat and then not do anything about it until I get here? Until I'm already live. To make sure nothing problem over here. Hello. Okay, well that story was, oh god, what was it? A Cold Steak by Phyllis Ann Carr. Phyllisannkarr, A Cold Steak. And it was kind of boring. The world was interesting enough, but it's not as fun when you make vampires just normal people who drink a little bit of blood sometimes. And then to have it two teenagers fighting over, I don't know, how bad vampires are. And then the vampire's like, no, I'm fine, see. I'm just like anybody else. I just need a little bit of blood. And he goes, oh, okay. And then they shake hands. It's just, okay, if you must make vampires boring, go ahead. But boy, is that boring. Aunt Horrible's Last Visit, Jeff Hecht. I believe this should be the right one. I should have only have skipped A Cold Steak. Oval, we read. Magic Stealer? Yes. The Blood Ghoul of Scarsdale. Great story. I loved it. Okay, Aunt Horrible always came in early June, just like the black flies. And I should drink more water. Ellie and the younger kids preferred the tiny, biting bugs from the woods. Every time she came, at least one neighbor got sick, making all the grown-ups worry. Aunt Horrible yelled at the kids all the time, and when she wasn't yelling, she was talking, and her cigarettes stank up the whole house. Once she had threatened to sew their lips shut to keep them quiet. Afterward, Billy, who was terrified of her, said that he had seen in a magic mirror that she was something evil, but the others knew he made up stories. Their father didn't like her either, but their mother said it would be impolite not to invite her to visit. Ellie just wished the grumpy old lady would go away and stop making everybody cross. Her name really was Hortense, but Billy had changed that to Horrible when he was 3. Even their parents would chuckle about that when she wasn't around, but nobody would say it to her face, not even Chuck when Ellie dared him. Aunt Horrible was not really a relative. She had married their grandmother's brother, Great Uncle Jack, just before he got sick and died. She lived in Florida most of the year, but came north to visit when it got too hot. Bringing magazines their mother didn't want them to read, a lot of faded flowered dresses, and a trunk she wouldn't let anyone open. The phone would ring one night and a taxi would bring her home from the bus a few days later. I kind of messed up that whole sentence. Wow. It doesn't matter though. The content is the same. This year, it was in 1957. She had come on a Wednesday, and by Saturday, the kids had decided that this year, they would get rid of her. She slept very late, so they couldn't make noise or play in the house. She didn't like the dog, so he had been moved to the doghouse, and their father had left early to help somebody put on a new roof. He always found chores somewhere else when Aunt Horrible visited. When Aunt Horrible finally got up, it was almost noon. She sat at the kitchen table, smoking and complaining to Ellie's mother and grandmother. They had Ellie make peanut butter sandwiches for the kids to eat in the backyard, while Chuck brought paper plates, cups, sour pickles, and Kool-Aid. The 5 kids held their war council at the picnic table. "We've got to get rid of her," Ellie announced. "She wants me to become a proper young lady, but I don't want to clean and sew and cook all day, and look what she made me change into on a Saturday," she complained, looking down at the frilly pink dress that she had almost outgrown. Why is this reminding me of being in, like, middle school and my fellow middle schoolers passing around some, like paper where we were all signed it, and we all were like, "We hate this one substitute teacher and we don't want her to come back," signed all of the kids in this section of this middle school. I don't remember what happened after that. I don't remember if anything happened from that. That poor teacher. "I'll put firecrackers in her purse," Chuck whispered. Aunt Horrible insisted that he stay in the house until his homework was done, and he'd missed 2 ball games in 3 days. Jack Harris promised I could have some of the ones his father got. Maybe I can get a big one and scare her away. The kids imagined blowing up Aunt Horrible's huge purse, scattering her knitting and copies of True Confessions. I don't know, man. She sounds pretty relatable. I don't know if I could make a whole group of children hate me. Sleeping until noon, carrying around your knitting and your purse everywhere, faded flower dresses in a trunk she won't let anyone open. That's very relatable. Anyway. Tom's eyes lit up and he took his thumb out of his mouth long enough to say, "Do it." Billy and Susie agreed, but Ellie didn't. "I don't think we can scare her," she warned. "Remember what happened last year with the snake?" They all nodded, even Tom, who was too young to remember anything. Chuck had caught a little garter snake in the field at the end of the road. First he'd scared Susie, then hidden the snake in Aunt Horrible's bed. She always stayed up very late, but her shriek had awakened the whole house. Chuck was spanked and had to spend the whole weekend in his room. He said he wouldn't have minded if he had scared Aunt Horrible away, but instead she had stayed longer than her usual 2 weeks. "I can get a real big one and blow her up," Chuck promised. "You'd have to get dynamite to do that," said Ellie. "I'll go steal her false teeth, so she's only got the 2 pointy ones left," offered Susie. "Then she'll have to go away and hide." Ellie shook her head, and Chuck said, "You just want to play with her false teeth, but that will only make her mad. I don't care if we make her mad. I want to get rid of her." "We'll tie her up and gag her so she can't say any evil spells," whispered Billy, looking at the others. "Then we'll put her in the wagon and take her to the post office and mail her to Australia." "Or Alaska or somewhere else far away," added Susie. "But we better take out her false teeth first." "I pull wagon," offered Tom. But Chuck objected. "That's my wagon, and you can't put grown-ups in it or you'll break it. Besides, we couldn't pay for all the stamps it would take out to mail her. The post office won't take people in the mail," added Ellie. Billy had just said he would build his own wagon when their mother told them to bring their things inside and put Tom down for his nap. Chuck went to ask Jack Harris about the firecrackers, and Billy and Susie went to the post office to ask how many stamps they would need to mail Aunt Horrible to Alaska. Ellie went to the library to find out how to get rid of grouchy ants. She thought it would take magic to get rid of Aunt Horrible. She wasn't sure if she believed in magic, and she didn't want to tell anyone else. Chuck would tease her, Billy would get scared, and Susie wouldn't keep anything secret. Couldn't keep anything secret. The library wasn't much help. Miss Wilkin found a few books on magic, but they told about card tricks or other pretend magic, not about how to make people really disappear. Ellie walked back to the desk with her little pile of books and looked up. What about real magic? The librarian laughed. We don't have books like that on our shelves. Ellie wondered if those might be the books kept in the locked cases marked for adults only, but she knew better than to ask. She walked back down Main Street and stopped at Woolworth's to get an ice cream sandwich. Before she could find her 2 nickels, she remembered the toy department had a magic set. However, like the books in the library, it had no real magic. Then she had another idea. If any place had anything magic, it would be Brown's Everything Store, and that was around the corner. Mr. and Mrs. Brown would buy and try to sell just about anything. Their store was old and narrow and went all the way to the back of the big brick building. The counter was in front, along one side, and shelves ran along both walls. The nicer things were in the front, which Miss Brown kept tidy. The strange things were in the back, where the store was messier, and boxes and dusty furniture, all for sale, stood in front of the shelves. Pause to drink. All the way at the back were shelves of used books. Some were almost new, 25-cent paperbacks, but many had faded bindings, and some were falling apart. Ellie found one book printed the year her grandmother was born, when Grover Cleveland was president. Mr. Brown never sorted the books, so Ellie always looked at all the shelves she could reach. She found 2 or 3 storybooks about magic, but nothing on real magic. She turned to an old wooden orange crate on the floor marked 5-cent specials. It was full of books the Browns couldn't sell but wouldn't throw out. Some had no covers, some were worn-out school books, and some were thick and full of long words in tiny print on crumbly old paper. Ellie looked at them all, though she couldn't understand some titles. Near the bottom, she found one with its front cover missing and an illegible signature on the front page, and turned to look for the title. Her heart fluttered when she read Reflections on Magic. The names of the author and publisher had been torn off, but 8 words in small type remained on what was left of the title page. Truth is the mirror is truth. The book had no date, but Ellie could tell it was very old by the feel of the yellowed paper and the look of the print. The book started with A Discourse on the Theories of Reflective Magic. That chapter was full of long words that Ellie didn't know, but as she flipped through the pages, her eyes caught other words she recognized. There was a section on vanishments, and a chapter on vampires, werewolves, and other evil beasts. A long chapter was titled Magical Transformations and Reflections. She closed the book and put the others back into the box. She looked up to see Mr. Brown standing over her. Found something? Nodding, she stood and fumbled for her nickel. Mr. Brown smiled gently as he took the money. Thanks for your business. There was no time to look at the book when she got home that afternoon. She had to get the clothes off the line, bring them into the house, and fold them for Susie to take to people's rooms. When her father returned, it was nearly 7 and time for dinner in the backyard. She and Chuck took load after load of stuff to the picnic table, while Aunt Horrible sat in the kitchen, nagging them about moving too slow and complaining too much. They were glad Aunt Horrible never ate with them. She was on a special diet, their mother said. After dinner, Susie found a bag of marshmallows in the pantry, and their father cut twigs so they could roast them on the still hot grill. Susie got hers an even brown, but Chuck caught his on fire. Ellie held a stick for Tom, and everyone was happy until Aunt Horrible came out after sundown, clutching her large purse in one hand and a lighted cigarette in the other. She pointed the cigarette at Tom, demanding, "Get that boy away from that grill." Susie and Billy ran to the other side of the yard, and Tom followed, leaving Ellie holding 2 sticks and listening to Aunt Horrible grumble as she sat down. It's too late for these children to be up. Chuck caught another marshmallow on fire and walked away with it still burning. Ellie tried to toast hers and Tom's just right. She dropped them both into the grill when something went bang behind her. Utter silence followed the blast. Smoke rose from Aunt Horrible's purse, and no one said anything for a full minute. All eyes turned to Chuck, who couldn't keep a straight face even when he had done nothing wrong, and he looked guiltier by the minute. "Charles Robert," his father shouted at last. "Did you?" And it was all over then. Tom ran, Billy ran, Susie ran. Chuck turned white as a sheet, and his father grabbed him. Chuck got his spanking, and everyone else was sent to bed. Not as funny. Don't hit your kids. "No talking, no giggling, no nothing," stormed their father. He paced the upstairs hall for 15 minutes, listening for the faintest sound, before he settled with his pipe and his paper in the armchair in his bedroom. From her room, Ellie could hear her mother, grandmother, and aunt talking downstairs. "That young ruffian belongs in a reformatory," declared Aunt Horrible. Her mother said something too soft to hear. "In my day, he would have been thrashed properly," came Aunt Horrible's loud voice again. "I'll tell you, I could teach those children to behave properly. Now, Hortense, you can't blame," her grandmother began, but her other words were too soft for Ellie to understand. It was her aunt's final words that scared Ellie the most. "Well, you mind me. I think it's time to put them in their places, and if you don't do it, I will." Then her heavy feet plodded up the stairs and down the hall to her room. Church was the next morning, and even if it was boring, at least there was no Aunt Horrible. When they got home, she was sitting in the living room, smoking in her bathrobe. Ellie hurried upstairs, saying she had to start her homework, but when she closed the door, she pulled out the magic book. She read the section on vanishments first. She found some formulas to make people vanish, but she didn't know where to find the things they needed. A hound's tooth and moss from a fallen tombstone would be easy, but not elixir of parrot tongue or essence of sea serpent slime. She read on and found that vanishments required finding something that had already vanished from the face of the earth. That didn't quite make sense, but she decided she could not get rid of Aunt Horrible that way. Transformations was her next hope, but most of them were strange too. She didn't know why she should want to turn a unicorn into an elf when she couldn't find either, nor could she see any reason to turn an elephant into a mastodon or an iguana into an iguanodon, which seemed to be some kind of dinosaur. Turning a turkey into a tyrannosaurus sounded interesting, but to do that she had to zap the turkey into something called a superconducting linear accelerator, and Ellie had no idea what that was. The magic that might be possible did not sound useful. She could turn the seventh son of a seventh son into a king with a piece of paper and a pencil, but she didn't know any family that big. She flipped through more pages. "Ye must know ye nature of ye beast," began the chapter on vampires, werewolves, and other evil beasts. Vampires drank only blood, and that sounded so horribly icky that Ellie couldn't imagine anyone wanting to be a vampire. Of course, she had never seen Aunt Horrible eat or drink anything at all, which was rather strange. But the old lady didn't look anything like Dracula in the old movie on television. She didn't sleep all day in a coffin either, but the old book said there were exceptions, and Aunt Horrible did stay out of the sun. Puzzled, Ellie read on. Werewolves, which sounded even worse, took their wolf forms at the full of the moon. The moon had been full when Aunt Horrible had arrived, so at least she wasn't one of those. The book described many other evil beasts and how to combat them. The problem was that each magic method worked for only one beast and did nothing to the others. All the descriptions confused Ellie, so what was Aunt Horrible? "Ye must look behind appearances," warned the book. "Evil beasts may look harmless to the eye in ordinary light. The way to tell their nature," it said, was to look at their reflections in a mirror in the fresh sunlight of dawn. Ellie decided the only thing to do was to sneak into Aunt Horrible's room before dawn, long before even the milkman was up, and see for herself. By the time Ellie settled down to do her homework, it was time for Sunday afternoon dinner. Usually, that was the best meal of the week, with a roast and a special dessert. However, nothing was pleasant when Aunt Horrible visited, even if she did not come to the table. The roast was only a chicken, and it was overcooked. The gravy was watery, and the grown-ups were in bad moods. Tom was sent to his room for dropping his plate, and grandmother scolded Susie for putting her elbows on the table. The rest of the day dragged by until it was time for bath and bed in the evening. Ellie went to bed early, carefully leaving her hand mirror on her dresser. She was awake a long time, and she might not have slept at all before her alarm clock, hidden under her pillow so that it would not wake Susie, rang at 4 a.m. With the window shade up, the moonlight was enough for Ellie to find the mirror. She picked her way carefully across the room, turning the doorknob softly so she wouldn't wake Susie in the other bed. Ellie was surprised that Aunt Horrible had locked her door, but she knew where her mother hid the skeleton key in the linen closet, in case Tom or Billy locked themselves in the bathroom. The key worked, and slowly she slipped through Aunt Horrible's door. The room was darker than hers, and she could barely see the shape of the bed. The window was wide open. She tried to decide where to stand to see Aunt Horrible's face in the mirror. She inched across the room, then gasped when she looked at the neatly made bed. No one was in it. Quickly, Ellie looked around the room, but saw no sign of Aunt Horrible. Her trunk sat by the wall, a pile of magazines was on the dresser, and her bathrobe was draped over the chair. The closet door was closed, but Ellie was too scared to look inside. She walked to the window and looked outside. Someone had removed the screen, and she leaned out into the cool, fresh air. She saw a shape move over the roof of the house next door. She first thought it was a bird, but as it came closer, she saw it was a bat. It kept coming toward the window, flying quickly. Ellie jumped back and slammed down the sash so it could not fly in. The bat swooped close to the glass, then pulled away at the last minute. Ellie stared at the creature. She had never seen a bat so close. I wonder how much of the fucking road outside you guys can hear, because that was loud for me. Anyway, there's a bat. Ellie stared at the creature. She had never seen a bat so close. It was a large, ugly thing. The bat flew away, dived back toward the window, then pulled away at the last minute. It did that again, then flew away into the dark. Shaking, Ellie looked outside. The sky seemed a little lighter, and the fresh air was tempting, but she was not about to open the window. She felt the mirror in her hand and looked down to see the dim reflection in the glass. It made her think of the book's words, and she looked again around the room to see where Aunt Horrible could have gone. She played with the mirror, trying to bring the start of dawn inside the dark room. It was then that Ellie saw the bat in the mirror. It had come closer when she was not looking, as if it hoped to sneak in the window through some unseen crack. She saw fear in its features, and her eyes caught the red reflection of its dark, bloody eyes. The face of Aunt Horrible flashed suddenly in the glass, framed around the bat's evil eyes. Her mouth gaped open, showing only the two pointed teeth in her upper jaw, now sharp and tipped with red. Then the face and the bat were gone in the growing dawn. Silently, her heart beating like thunder, Ellie slipped out of the room, locked the door behind her, and went back to her room. She closed and locked both windows before she climbed into the bed. She did not close her eyes as it grew light. The morning brought school, and Ellie took the welcome excuse to escape from the house. She returned to find a police car parked on the street and two policemen sitting in the living room talking to her mother and grandmother. "Ellie," her mother called, "come here, please." She walked slowly toward the couch, stepping around the blocks that Tom normally was not allowed to have in the living room. Your Aunt Hortense appeared. I hate her name. Your Aunt Hortense disappeared last night. She didn't come out of her room today, and by afternoon I was afraid something had happened. I couldn't find the skeleton key, so I had to call the police. They opened the door and she was gone. Did you hear anything last night? No, Mother, I didn't hear anything, Ellie said slowly, but I'm glad she's gone, and I hope she never comes back. She ran upstairs, crying, and all the rest of that summer she locked the windows tight before she went to bed. And that's Aunt Horrible's Last Visit by Jeff Hecht, where a young child murders someone. Ellie just fucking murdered someone. She just murdered someone. Oh my god. Why is that? That's so funny. Fuck. Okay, Mama Gone by Jane Yolen. That young child definitely just murdered someone. Mama died 4 nights ago, giving birth to my baby sister Anne. Bubba cried and cried. Mama gone, in his little boy voice, but I never let out a single tear. There was blood red as any sunset all over the bed from that birthing, and when Papa saw it, he rubbed his head against the cabin wall over and over and over and made little animal sounds. Suki washed Mama down and placed the baby on her breast for a moment. Remember, she whispered. Mama gone, Bubba wailed again, but I never cried. By all rights, we should have buried her with garlic in her mouth and her hands and feet cut off, what with her being vampire-kin and all, but Papa absolutely refused. Your mama couldn't stand garlic, he said, when the words stopped rushing out of his mouth and his eyes had cleared. It made her come all over with rashes. She had the sweetest mouth and hands. And that was that. Not a one of us could make him change his mind, not even Grandad Stokes or Pop Wilbur or any other of the men who come to pay their last respects. And as Papa is a preacher and a brimstone man, they let it be. The onlyest thing he would allow was for us to tie red ribbons round her ankles and wrists as a kind of sign, like a line of blood. Everybody hoped that would do. But on the next day, she rose from out her grave and commenced to prey upon the good folk of Taunton. Which would you rather be? The woman who's vampire kin, who dies giving birth and comes back as a vampire because her husband refused to shove garlic in her mouth? Or would you rather be the husband who refused to shove garlic in the mouth of your wife so she could come back to life? And then she starts hunting people. Both of those are amusing to me. Oh, God. Okay. Of course, she came to our house first, that being the dearest place she knew. I saw her outside my window, gray as a gravestone, her dark eyes like the holes in a shroud. When she stared in, she didn't know me, though I had always been her favorite. Mama, be gone, I said, and waved my little cross at her, the one she had given me the very day I'd been born. Avant. The old Babel word sat heavy in my mouth. She put her hand up to the window frame, and as I watched, the gray fingers turned splotchy pink from all the garlic I had rubbed into the wood. Good for you. Black tears dropped from her black eyes then, but I never cried. She tried each window in turn, and not a person awake in the house but me. But I had done my work well, and the garlic held her out. She even tried the door, but it was no use. By the time she left, I was so sleepy I dropped down right by the door. Papa found me there at cockcrow. He never did ask what I was doing, and if he guessed, he never said. Little Joshua Greeno was found dead in his crib. The doctor took 2 days to come over the mountains to pronounce it. By then, the garlic around his little bed to keep him from walking, too, had mixed with the death smells. Everybody knew, even the doctor, and him a city man. It hurt his mama and Papa sore to do the cutting, but it had to be done. The men came to our house that very noon to ask about what had to be. Papa kept shaking his head all through their talking, but even his being preacher didn't stop them. Once a vampire walks these mountain hollers, there's nary a house or barn that's safe. Nighttime is lost time, and no one can afford to lose much stock. So they made their sharp sticks out of green wood, the curling shavings littering our cabin floor. Bubba played with them, not understanding. Suki was busy with the baby, nursing it with a bottle and a sugar teat. It was my job to sweep up the wood curls. They felt slick on one side, bumpy on the other, like my heart. Papa said I was the one let her turn into a night walker. It's my business to stake her out. No one argued, especially not the Greenos, their eyes still red from weeping. Just take my children, Papa said, and if anything goes wrong, cut off my hands and feet and bury me at Mill's Cross under the stone. There's garlic hanging in the pantry. Mandy Jane will string me some. So Suki took the baby and Bubba off to the Greenos' house, that seeming the right thing to do, and I stayed the rest of the afternoon with Papa, stringing garlic and pressing more into the windows, but the strand over the door he took down.
I have to let her in somewhere, he said, and this is where I'll make my stand. He touched me on the cheek, the first time ever. Papa never has been much for show. Now you run along to the greenhouse, Mandy Jane, he said, and remember how much your mama loved you. This isn't her, child. Mama's gone. Something else has come to take her place. I should have remembered that the good book says, the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything. I wanted to ask him how the vampire knew to come first to our house then, but I was silent, for Papa had been asleep and hadn't seen her. I left without giving him a daughter's kiss, for his mind was well set on the night's doing, but I didn't go down the lane to the greenhouse at all. Wearing my triple strand of garlic, with my cross about my neck, I went to the burying ground, to Mama's grave. It looked so raw against the greening hillside. The dirt was red clay, but all it looked like to me was blood. There was no cross on it yet, no stone. That would come in a year. Just a humping, a leaping of red dirt over her coffin, the plain pine wood box hastily made. I lay face down in that dirt, my arms opened wide. Oh, Mama, I said, the good book says you are not dead, but sleepeth. Sleep quietly, Mama, sleep well. And I sang to her the lullaby she had always sung to me, and then to Bubba, and would have sung to baby Anne had she lived to hold her. Blacks and bays, dapples and grays, all the pretty little horses. And as I sang, I remembered Papa thundering at prayer meeting once, behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death. The rest of the song just stuck in my throat then, so I turned over on the grave and stared up at the setting sun. Ooh. It had been a long and wearying day, and I fell asleep right there in the burying ground. Any other time, fear might have overcome sleep. How are you getting louder instead of quieter? Any other time, fear might have overcome sleep, but I just closed my eyes and slept. When I woke, it was dead night. The moon was full and sitting between the horns of two hills. There was a sprinkling of stars overhead, and Mama began to move the ground beneath me, trying to rise. The garlic strands must have worried her, for she did not come out of the earth all at once. It was the scrabbling of her long nails at my back that woke me. I leaped off the grave and was wide awake. Standing aside the grave, I watched as first her long gray arms reached out of the earth. Then her head, with its hair that was once so gold, now gray and streaked with black, and its shroud eyes, emerged. And then her body, with its winding sheet, stained with dirt and torn from walking to and fro upon the land. Then her bare feet with blackened nails, though alive Mama used to paint those nails. Her one vanity, and Papa allowed it, seeing she was so pretty and otherwise not vain. She turned toward me as a hummingbird toward a flower, and she raised her face up, and it was gray and bony. Her mouth peeled back from her teeth, and I saw that they were pointed, and her tongue was barbed. Mama gone, I whispered in Bubba's voice, but so low I could hardly hear it myself. She stepped toward me off that grave, lurching down the hump of dirt, but when she got close, the garlic strands and the cross stayed her. Mama, she turned her head back and forth. It was clear she could not see with those black shroud eyes. She only sensed me there, something warm, something alive, something with the blood running like satisfying streams through the blue veins. Sounds like they're racing out there. Mama, I said again, try and remember. That searching, awful face turned toward me again, and the pointy teeth were bared once more. Her hands reached out to grab me, then pulled back. Remember how Bubba always sucks his thumb with that funny little noise you always said was like a little chuck in its hole, and how Suki hums through her nose when she's baking bread, and how I listen to your belly to hear the baby, and how Papa always starts each meal with a blessing on things that grow fresh in the field. The gray face turned for a moment toward the hills, but I wasn't even sure she could hear me, but I had to keep trying. And remember when we picked the blueberries and Bubba fell down the hill, tumbling head end over, and we laughed until we heard him, and he was saying the same 6 things over and over till long past bed. The gray face turned back toward me, and I thought I saw a bit of light in the eyes, but it was just reflected moonlight. And the day Papa came home with the new ooey lamb, and we fed her on a sugar tea. You stayed up all the night, and I slept in the straw by your side. It was as if stars were twinkling in those dead eyes. I couldn't stop staring, but I didn't dare stop talking either. And remember the day the bluebird sunned itself to the kitchen window, and you held it in your hands. You warmed it to life, you said. To life, Mama. Those stars began to run down the gray cheeks. There's living, Mama, and there's dead. You've given so much life. Don't be bringing death to these hills now. I could see that the stars were gone from the sky over her head. The moon was setting. Papa loved you too much to cut your hands and feet. You gotta return that love, Mama. You gotta. Veins of red ran along the hills, outlining the rocks. As the sun began to rise, I took off one strand of garlic, then the second, then the last. I opened my arms. Have you come back, Mama, or are you gone? The gray woman leaned over and clasped me tight in her arms. Her head bent down toward mine, her mouth on my forehead, my neck, the outline of my little cross burning across her lips. She whispered, "Here and gone, child, here and gone," and a voice like wind in the coppice, like the shaking of willow trees, of willow leaves. I felt her kiss on my cheek, a brand. Then the sun came between the hills and hit her full in the face, burning her as red as earth. She smiled at me, and then there was only dust motes in the air, dancing. When I looked down at my feet, the grave dirt was hardly disturbed, but Mama's gold wedding band gleamed atop it. I knelt down and picked it up and unhooked the chain holding my cross. I slid the ring into the chain, and the two nestled together right in the hollow of my throat. I sang. Blacks and bays, dapples and grays, and from the earth itself the final words sang out. All the pretty little horses. That was when I cried, long and loud, a sound I hope never to make again as long as I live. Then I went back down the hill and home, where Papa still waited by the open door. Damn, man, Jane Yolen is a good writer. Mama Gone by Jane Yolen. We have read 3 of her stories now, I believe. I believe she was in the last collection, too. That is a good writer. That is somebody who writes a lot of short stories. I am impressed. Bravo. That was a lovely, sad story about a vampire mom. One. Some contents are wild. Sometimes a child just kills a woman. Sometimes a child just kills a woman because she doesn't like her. And sometimes you cry because you have to let your vampire mom die for good. Richie by Lawrence Watt Evans. I think this is the last one. Yeah, gear up. It's the last story from our young adult short story collection. Yeah. Alright, a little more water. Okay. Ashley was only 14 when she saw Richie for the first time. She was at Lake Forest Mall with her mother on a Friday night, doing some back-to-school shopping and being extremely bored when she saw this guy hanging over the rail beside the escalator. He was tall and thin and looked about 16, wearing black jeans and a black t-shirt and black windbreaker even though it was August, and black sneakers with black socks. His hair was long and black and spiked. All that black really stood out against the pastel and beige of the mall and the other people, and Ashley couldn't stop noticing him, so she looked him over. His face was as pale as cream, the palest she'd ever seen, as different from the pink and brown faces around him as his clothes were from the background. His eyes were an odd shade of green, and they were staring right at her. The guy looked seriously creepy, Ashley thought. She stared back at first, but he didn't turn away, didn't so much as blink, and she lost her nerve. She looked straight ahead, at the back of her mother's blouse, and when she looked again, he was gone. She saw him 6 months later, on a Tuesday night, when JJ, who had his driver's license, took Ashley and Maureen and Shanna to the mall to hang out. The 4 of them were in front of Mrs. Fields eating giant cookies and laughing about some stupid joke when Ashley looked down over the rail and saw him sitting beside the fountains, staring up at her. Black jeans, black t-shirt, black socks, and high tops. No windbreaker this time, though. He was wearing a black woolen pea coat like a sailor. His black hair was still long, but the spikes were gone. His face was just as white as ever, and even from up here she could see the green of his eyes. She ran a few strands alongside the rail, and his gaze followed her. She made a face, then ran back to the others. "What's up?" JJ asked her. She shook her head. Nothing. She didn't look back over the rail for several minutes. When she did, the black-haired boy was gone. 4 months after that, when Ashley was 15, she was at the mall again with Maureen, Friday after dinner, more or less looking for a new swimsuit, and the 2 of them were talking about what they were going to do that summer, when Ashley looked up and found herself looking straight into those weird green eyes. She stopped walking. Maureen stopped as well. "Hi," the black-haired guy said. "Hi yourself," Maureen answered. Ashley didn't say anything. She was too startled. She remembered him, of course. He was the sort of face and style that are hard to forget, and she wasn't a girl who had boys staring at her in that creepy way all that often. Her looks didn't rate that kind of attention. And right now, he was staring at her again, only this time it didn't seem creepy at all. Maybe it was because he wasn't 50 feet away, but right there in front of her, looking right into her eyes, or maybe it was because she was a little older, but he didn't seem creepy. Quite the opposite, in fact. "My name's Richie," he said. He had a really great voice, smooth and velvety, Ashley thought. "I'm Maureen," said Maureen. "That's Ashley." "Hi," he said. "Hi," Ashley managed. She smiled. He smiled back, but it was a tight, closed-mouth smile, no teeth showing. They managed to lose Maureen after a while. She saw that she wasn't going to get anywhere and decided, with a shrug, that there was no reason to stand in Ashley's way. Richie had some money, so he bought her a sandwich at Arby's and they talked. Afterward, Ashley was never sure just what they'd talked about. She didn't get his last name or his phone number or his address. She did remember asking where he went to school. "I don't," he said. "I get tutored at home." He grimaced. "Why?" she asked. "Oh, you know, my parents don't trust the schools. They think it's dangerous, and I had some health problems. You don't want to hear about that." He was right, Ashley realized. She didn't want to hear about that. Afterward, though, when she met Maureen and got driven home, she couldn't remember what she had wanted to hear instead, except for one thing. She was going to meet him at the mall the next night to see a movie. The movie was great, and being with Richie was great, even though he didn't try to kiss her or anything, which was sort of disappointing. Somehow, she didn't really mind, though. They saw each other off and on after that. At first, they always met at the mall, but after a while, Richie began meeting her at home sometimes, after dinner, for walks. She never saw his home, though, and he was usually pretty late when he came by, and they never actually ate at the same time. Ashley figured maybe he couldn't afford it. They saw movies and hung out at the mall and took walks along the sidewalks under the street lamps. Sometimes they just talked, but Ashley could never remember much of what they talked about. And he never kissed her. He put his arm around her, cuddled up to her, but never kissed her. And the cuddling never went beyond what they could do in public. At first it was sweet, but after a while Ashley began to wonder. Then, in late August, JJ made his big announcement. He'd gotten the use of his uncle's place in Ocean City for a weekend, and everyone was invited for an end-of-the-summer beach party. Carloads were organized. Anyone who could drive and had access to a car was recruited, with every seat spoken for. The apartment, a block from the beach, would be for changing clothes and cooking and storage. The actual party would be out on the sand. "You'll come, won't you, Richie?" Ashley asked. Richie blinked, and his mouth twisted. "I don't know," he said. "I'm not much on beaches. The sun hurts my eyes, and I can't swim." "So who wants to swim?" Ashley said, disappointed. "And you can wear shades." "Well, maybe. When is it again?" Saturday. All day. On the beach at 130th Street in Ocean City. I'll try, Ash, but I'll probably be pretty late getting there." "Okay, but try, all right?" Richie nodded. Ashley stared at him, wondering. He was such a neat guy, but he could be so weird sometimes. He never ate popcorn with her in the movies. She'd never seen him eat anything. He always wore black. She'd never seen him with his shirt off, never seen him grin. She'd never seen where he lived, and he never came around until after dark. but he was so sexy, the way he moved, and those green eyes, and she got a warm feeling just being near him and talking to him, like she was about to melt. Richie, she began, I like you, but what? She didn't answer right away, but a moment later she said, you better be at the beach, that's all. She rode out with Maureen and Robbie B and Dory and Dave, and they got there about noon and found JJ and Shanna and about half a dozen others on the beach setting up. Ashley loved it. She splashed in the ocean, ate hot dogs for lunch, and then rode down to the boardwalk with some of the others, where she bought an Ocean City t-shirt and had a dozen quarters into different games without ever getting to post her initials on the high score lists. They giggled all the way back to 130th Street, thinking of raunchy slogans to put on t-shirts. Ashley had hoped that Richie would be there, waiting when they got back. He wasn't. She asked. No one had seen him. Giggling in the car had been the high point of her day. From there, it was a slow, steady descent into gloom as Richie failed to show. Ashley genuinely enjoyed the sun and the sea and all the rest, but as the afternoon wore on, her disappointment and anger at Richie's absence grew until it overwhelmed her enjoyment. It didn't help that she wasn't sure whether there was any way he could turn up once everyone else was there. She didn't know if he had the use of a car, or even if he had a driver's license. She'd never seen his house or met his parents. How could she know so little about him? That just made it all worse somehow. She hid her feelings until dinner, which started around sunset. Someone had brought back a huge bag of takeout steamed crabs from some place on the coastal highway, and the whole crowd, grown to about 40 by this time, gathered around to pig out on them, strewing broken bits of shell all about. Ashley sat back a little apart from the others, trying to see through the growing shadows, her appetite gone. Richie hadn't shown. She got up to pace, and after about 3 steps, her foot landed on the sharp edge of a broken crab shell. That was the last straw. She yelled at Shauna, who was sitting closest, "Watch where you throw your garbage." Then, ignoring Shauna's protest, she stormed off up the beach, onto the sidewalk and back toward JJ's borrowed apartment. She rounded the corner of the building, heading for the door, and nearly ran into Richie. He was standing there with an uncertain smile on his face. "Hi," he said. "Sorry I'm so late." "What? How'd you get here?" she asked, dazed. "Maybe I flew," he said, still smiling. She looked up into his eyes, then burst out crying, her forehead falling onto his chest, her arms going around him. For a moment he seemed startled and resisting, but then his arms closed around her. His own head fell forward, and she felt his cheek brushing down across her hair, and then the brush of his lips on her neck, and she thought, with a burst of wonder, that he was finally going to kiss her. His lips parted, and she felt moistness, and then 2 sharp, sharp points, and she tried to jerk away, but he held her, and then the pain vanished, and she felt only a pressure and a suction on her neck. She tried to struggle, but he was too strong, much stronger than she had ever realized. His arms like steel, and she couldn't get her breath to scream. She didn't really want to scream. She was too tired. She'd been tired for hours, but this was a new sort of tiredness. Not the disappointed weariness that had been gnawing at her, but a warm, lazy languor, like lying in a nice hot bath after a day of pleasant exercise. When he finally withdrew, she was almost asleep. She wanted to just slump into his arms and let him carry her off somewhere, but then Shauna's voice spoke behind her. "Ashley, are you okay, girl?" Richie looked up and Ashley turned, startled. Shauna said, "Oh, hi, Richie. Glad you can make it." "I'm fine," Ashley said. There was a moment of awkward silence, and then Shauna said, "Well, hey, you two don't want me butting in, do you? I'll just go on in and use the bathroom and see you guys later." She smiled and stepped past them. Richie and Ashley watched her go. The mood was broken, and Ashley was awake again, but bone-tired, drained, in fact. She slid down the wall of the building into a sitting position on the sidewalk and looked up at Richie. She didn't meet his eyes. "You're a vampire," she said, accusingly. Tired as she was, it seemed very important that she get everything clear right here and now. He nodded, watching her. "You really did fly here?" "Last night," he said, "but I couldn't come out until the sun was down." You sucked my blood just then." Her hands came up and touched her neck, and came away with the smear of blood, dark red in the fluorescent glow of the streetlights. He nodded once again. This, Ashley thought, certainly explains a heck of a lot. But it didn't explain everything. She felt her strength coming back somewhat now that she was off her feet and out of his spell, whatever that spell was, and she wanted an explanation for the rest of it. "We've been dating for months," she said. "Why'd you wait so long?" "Because I wasn't sure about you," Richie said, sliding down to sit beside her. "I'm still not, but I couldn't wait anymore." "You weren't sure about what about me?" Ashley asked, baffled. "How do you react? What you'd do? Whether you'd want to see me again?" He kept his face expressionless as he watched her closely. "See you again?" Ashley demanded. She looked at her bloody fingers and then at Richie's eyes. "Why would you want to see me again?" she asked angrily. "You got what you wanted." He shook his head. "No, I just don't want a one-night stand. I don't just want a one-night stand. I want a long-term relationship." She stared at him. "What sort of relationship? You mean sucking blood? Regularly?" He nodded. "Ew, that's sick," she said, sliding away from him a little. "I can't help it," he said, shrugging. "It's what I do." "Yeah, but, I mean, how often would you do it? Wouldn't I get sick? Wouldn't I die?" "Well, yeah," he said. "Eventually, you would, sort of." He smiled at her, the broadest smile she'd ever seen on his face, and his teeth showed. His teeth. And his fangs. "Sort of?" she shouted, pushing at him. "Sort of die? Hey, I want to live." He caught her hand. "Yeah, sort of," he said. "You wouldn't stay dead." She blinked. For a moment, she sat staring silently at him. "I wouldn't?" she asked at last. She knew the stories, of course. "You mean I'd become a vampire?" He nodded. "And lived forever?" He nodded again. "And never grow old?" Again. She eyed him suspiciously. "How do you know?" she asked. He gestured at himself. "How old do you think I am?" 16, she said. "Don't try and tell me you're hundreds of years old." "No," he said, "not hundreds. I was born in 1932. "You're 16, maybe 17. She pulled her hand away. "I was 16 when it happened, in 1948, he said, letting her fingers slide free. 40 years ago. "So if I let you suck my blood," Ashley said, "I'll die, and I'll come back as a vampire, and you'll live forever, just the age I am now." No, wait. "I'll die, and I'll come back as a vampire, and I'll live forever, just the age I am now?" He nodded, smiling. "And what about my parents? And everyone will think I'm dead, and how can I explain that I'm not?" The smile vanished. "Well, yeah, that's rough. I know. You'll have to leave, go live somewhere else. Be someone else for a while, like I did. My mother's still in California, where I grew up. I think she's in a nursing home. I haven't seen her since I snuck back for a visit in 43, he frowned. She thought I was a dream. And my dad, well, he died years ago. But where do you live then? Just by yourself?" He grimaced. "Yeah, my coffin's in a storeroom." "A storeroom? Where?" "I can't tell you that. Not yet. But you sleep in a coffin? In a storeroom somewhere?" "Yeah. And if I died, I'd do the same thing? Is that the idea?" "Well," she cut him off. "And I'd have to go away, never see my folks again, never see any of my friends?" Well, yeah. "Would you come with me?" He smiled again. Yes, Ashley, I would. We'd have each other." "Yeah," Ashley said sourly. "Just each other." "Yeah, but Ash, you'd live forever. You'd always be young, same as you are now. Think about it. You could be the same age you are now forever. Look, I was a teenager in 1948, dancing the jitterbug, and I was a teenager in the 50s, listening to rock and roll, and in the 60s at the demonstrations and festivals, and in the discos in the 70s, and I'm still a teenager." Ashley thought about it. "Think about it. Staying young while your enemies go on and get old and ugly," Richie insisted. "Yeah," Ashley objected, "but my friends would get old and die too, Richie. I wouldn't. And think of all the things you'll see. Think what I've seen. All the movies I've seen, all the music I've heard, all while I was young enough to enjoy it. So I'd be 15 forever?" "That's right," Richie said, smiling again. "You'll be young and beautiful forever." Young and beautiful, Richie. I'll be 15. I'm not beautiful, and I'm too damned young. I can't drive, can't get a job. Adults treat me like a kid, but I'm not a kid. Richie, 15 sucks. I don't want to be 15. I want to grow up. The smile vanished. "So did I," he said. "What I said? Well, it's true. But so did I." For a moment they sat there, each waiting silently for the other to say something else. Then he stood up and stepped back into a shadow, and in his black clothes she could barely see him. She blinked, and he was gone. "Richie?" she called, unsteadily. She didn't see him again for another 8 years. Shauna found her crying on the sidewalk, and someone drove her home, and she didn't see Richie again. Until one day in the mall, when she looked across and saw a pale kid all in black, trying to look tough, and she realized he was familiar somehow. The memories came back, and she knew who it was, and she took a step toward him, and her thoughts were tripping over each other. 23 was a good age. She didn't want to die, didn't want to grow old. 15 was wrong, but 23 was all right, if it was all true, if it wasn't just a dream. But she'd be undead, not really alive. She'd have to prey on others, but to live forever, never grow old? He looked up and saw her, and he smiled bitterly and shook his head. He stepped back and vanished in the crowd. She stopped. He didn't want her anymore. He was just a kid. He wanted a kid his own age, not a grown woman. After all, misery loves company. He was a kid. He was 16, would always be 16, an eternity of 16. She turned away and went back to her shopping, fighting back tears, unsure whether she wanted to cry over her own lost opportunity or for the eternity Richie faced. Damn. I don't know if this is cringe to say, but while I was reading this, I was thinking about Twilight. I used to be a huge Twilight fan, huge Edward Levin stan freak. So it was really interesting that, a good 10 years before that book even came out, we had this short little story lamenting about a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old trapped as a 16-year-old forever, and how lonely and sad that is. And not look how cool they are. They're so rich and they're going to be young forever, and look at their cars they're driving, and oh my God, he loves me and I don't want to age a day over 17. Refreshing and lovely. That was Richie by Lawrence Watt Evans, and that is officially the last story that we have in this little book of ours here. The cover is on the floor. I always take them off because I always end up ruining them, but then I take them off and then I lose them and then they get ruined anyway, so what am I doing? The book is Vampires, edited by Jane Yolen and Martin H. Greenberg, and I am tired of reading, and I loved some of the stories that we read tonight. I hope you guys did too. If you have any thoughts, feel free to share them in the comments or chat or whatever, and also subscribe. And also, I have an Instagram now that I'm not updating the way I wasn't updating YouTube, but I'm gonna try to get back on that horse and make it a thing. So, if you follow me here, follow me there, subscribe or whatever. It's fun and cool. Let's talk about crafts and vampires together. Oh God. Okay. I will definitely be back here next week at 6 o'clock. Sundays, 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Getting back on the horse. We're going to keep doing this. I want to keep doing this. I love talking about vampires. I missed it while I was gone. So I'm happy to be back, and I hope you guys are too, which is something I've already said. So at this point, I need to log off. Okay. Good night. I love you. Read some vampires while you're gone. Don't parasocially love me back. Pretend I didn't say I love you.